just wanted to go over a few things. We've already had a few events out at the park. They've been pretty successful. It's been really nice. If you haven't been there, please go visit. We've got with us Deb and Bob Tribby, who are, they take care of the park out there with Common Grounds. Deb's a native plant specialist, so she's marked all the plants, and Bob and Deb do all the weeding, and they're just really great to take care of that place. Yes, today our program's about, since it's Florida Archaeological Month, I thought we'd invite somebody from the Florida Archaeological Society that's located at USF. This is Rebecca O'Sullivan, and she's going to give you a little background on herself and then talk about Paleo Indians. So enjoy.
Really excited to come out here. It was, really cool driving through the neighborhood and also learning a little bit about the sites that you all have here in your neighborhood before I came out here. It's an amazing archaeological site that's right here, where you're living. So it's pretty cool. It'd be pretty exciting. I would be excited to live here if I was living. I'm sure you all must be too. So, like Hope was saying, my name is Becky O'Sullivan. I'm an archaeologist. I work over at the University of South Florida at the Tampa campus up there. And so I work in the Department of Anthropology, but the kind of office that I work for is the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And pretty much what my job is to do is to go out and talk to people about archaeology in the state of Florida, all the wonderful history and heritage that we have here in Florida, and to share that knowledge with other people. So that's why I'm here today. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start just talking a little bit about archaeology first, what archaeologists do. Then I'm going to talk about the Paleo Indians, the first explorers who really came to Florida, and some of the evidence that we have of them, especially at places like where we're at right now. And then I'm going to talk about some of the artifacts that we find that Native peoples left behind from all different time periods of Florida prehistory. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. And at any point, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has, so shout them out there.
Becky, yeah. I was remiss in not introducing Herb and Paula Elliott, who found Paleo Park when they first moved here. So they have a wealth of information too.
Fantastic. And so I just want to say, thank you so much for, sharing your collection and making sure that the site was, recorded and shared with everybody, because it's so important. It's such a wonderful place, and it has so much to tell us about the past year in Florida. So that's a really wonderful thing that you all did. Thank you. Archaeology. Anyone have any ideas? What do archaeologists do? I want to share your thoughts on archaeology. What do we do? We dig in the dirt. Yes, we do love digging in the dirt. I enjoy digging in the dirt. What else do we do?
Bring back the past.
Bring back the past. I love that. Yeah. And the work of an archaeologist is to study people who lived in the past by looking at the stuff that they left behind, right? But it's like a lot more than that. It's also telling those stories of people who lived a long time ago, making connections between the lives of people who died 10,000 years ago and with people who are alive today. And that's what it's all about, bringing that past to life. And so the way that we do that is by the things that we find, right? By digging in the dirt, trekking out in the woods, digging to find these clues. And so these clues that we're looking for, archaeologists called artifacts. And an artifact is anything that somebody has made or used or thrown away or eaten or done something with in the past. All right. So that could be something like this, which, what's this thing? Right, like an arrowhead or a spear point. This is what most people think of when they think of an artifact. It could be a tiny chip of stone. It could be a broken piece of pottery. It could be an animal bone from someone's ancient meal or a shell. Or it could be something a little more recent, like a broken piece of chamber pot or a glass bottle or anything like that. Technically, anything that's 50 years or older could be an artifact or an archaeological site. Yeah. I think every archaeologist, when they turn 50 years old, someone like fills out a site file form for them or something. That's like the joke that we always have, right? So these artifacts, a lot of times they're really beautiful, right? They're made by someone who was a wonderful craftsperson a long time ago. Like this point that you see here, the stone that it's made of is beautiful, right? It's got these kind of like bandings to it. It's well made, like it's pretty to look at, right? But so we can appreciate it for that. But the real value, the real interest for an archaeologist looking at this thing is what it can tell us about people, because ultimately that's what we're trying to study, right? What was life like for people? And so each one of these things that you see on the table, each one of these artifacts that we find, it has a part of a story to tell. And so it's the archaeologist's job to put that story back together. Native peoples in Florida, they didn't have their own system of writing, right? That's why we call it, prehistory. They obviously had a history, but they weren't writing it down. So the only way that we can learn about people who were living here in Florida pre-contact, before Europeans arrived, is by looking at the stuff that these native people left behind. That's our only way, besides oral histories and stories that are passed down, that we can learn about them. So each one of these things has a little part of that story to tell. And it's the job of the archaeologist to kind of piece that back together. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specific artifacts in a second. But, getting to the Paleo Indians, right? These first people who lived here in Florida. When I talk about the Paleo Indians, I like to talk about them as explorers. Because if you think about it, they were really the first explorers who actually came to the New World, right? When the Spanish arrived in the 1400s and the 1500s in Florida, there were people who had been living here, and their ancestors had been already living here for more than 14,000 years. The oldest archaeological site that has been found in Florida was recently found in North Florida in the Osceola River at the Page Ladson site, and that dates back 14,500 years. So that's the earliest evidence that we have of people in Florida. And a lot of these really early sites we find in areas around springs and in rivers. So that's why it makes sense that this site here, we have this wonderful little spring that's here, and it makes sense that we would find those Paleo-Indian artifacts around it. And there's a reason for that. And it's because, not only were these native people, these explorers, they were coming into a world with no people had ever lived, right? They were also coming into a world that was much different than the Florida that we think of today, right? So this was at the end of the last ice age. So the sea levels were much, much lower than they are today. Florida was actually twice the size that it is today. So from where we are, it would probably be like 60 or 70 miles out to the west to get to the beach. That's how far inland we would be. So this would be like a super inland, like landlocked area. So just think of, we're not close to the water, we're like super inland, right? And so all that land that's now underwater, right, as sea levels rose, it would have been these kind of rolling savannas, grasslands, going all the way down to the ocean. And roaming around on those grasslands were all these different animals that we don't have today. Extinct bison, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloth, saber-toothed cats, these big crazy animals that are a kind of paleo armadillo, are called a glyptodont. They're, some of them were as big as like a VW bug kind of a thing. I think the joke in like paleoarchaeology is that every kind of megafauna, these extinct animals, gets compared to the size of a VW bug, whether it's a glyptodont or something else, right? So, there's huge animals that are roaming around. And also the climate was much different. It wasn't like cold and icy, right? Like I said, it's the end of the ice age, but we were much, farther south than the actual glaciers. But it was much cooler and drier in Florida at that time than it is today. So a lot of the kind of water features that you think of for our state, like the Everglades, had not formed yet. There's no Everglades. A lot of the rivers that we think of in Florida today, they were more of a kind of a trickle, right? So these springs, these places where water is kind of naturally welling up, were like little oases on the landscape that people could come to and get the water and the things that they needed, but they were also kind of like really great meeting spots for people. Think about it, like, Florida is this like big open grassland. That's not giving you like a lot of landmarks, right, to figure out where you're at and figure out where other people are at. So these springs were also really great places where people could meet up. Native peoples, the Paleo Indians at that time, they would move around to follow animals, to hunt them, and move around in little family groups. And so, you want to meet up with some other people so you can like marry off your daughter or your son or whatever, right? And so these springs were also a great place where people could do that and, stop for a while and meet up with other groups and, exchange kids and all that kind of good stuff, right? So they were important for a lot of different things. So hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture of what Florida was actually like at that time. So, the Paleo Indians in Florida, the places where we found things that kind of date to that time period, thousands and thousands of years ago, more than 10,000 years ago, are around these freshwater sources. That's usually where we find these Paleo Indian artifacts, at these springs and these river sites. And so a lot of work has been done in North Florida, in the Osceola and the Wassissa rivers, because they have these little springs that are along the rivers as well that have been there since Paleo times. And so archaeologists actually work underwater to find the artifacts and the things that people left behind. So like at the Page Ladson site, really exciting. An archaeologist from the Florida State University has been working there more recently. And she's the one that found this, the oldest, artifact in Florida, this 14,500-year-old stone point, which I don't obviously have it here, but she had this, big stone, kind of what we would call a biface or a point from like a spear that she found. And one of the ways that she was able to actually figure out how old it was is by carefully digging under the water in these layers of like organic material. And what it actually turned out that these different layers was Mastodon digesta. So it's actually layers and layers of thousands and thousands of year old mastodon poop. And so in between one of these layers, she found this stone point. And so then by taking samples of that digesta above it and below it, she's able to do radiocarbon dating and figure out how old it is. So archaeology, it's a lot of storytelling, but it's also a lot of detective work. And the only way that we can like figure out how old something is or what it was used for is when we have that really good context of where it was found, so we can get those dates and figure out how old something is. I thought that's kind of a funny story, but that's how they figured it out. Some other really interesting Paleo-Indian sites that are more to our south, one is called Little Salt Spring. Has anyone ever heard of Little Salt Spring before? It's down in Northport. Little Salt Spring is a spring-fed sinkhole, pretty much, and archaeologists have been working there for a while too, and they found a lot of really interesting things that date to this kind of Paleo-Indian time period. So today, if you go there, it looks like it's a lake, right? Like the water's like at the surface of this kind of round lake. But if you went there in Paleo-Indian times, the water would have been much lower, and that's because the sea levels were also much lower. So you have the sea levels are lower, there's less pressure on our Florida aquifer, right? And so the water in these springs would have also been much lower as well. That's why like our rivers and like the Everglades hadn't formed yet, because there wasn't that pressure to push that water up, okay? So imagine a big sinkhole, and then like 40 feet down this ledge with water in it. And that's what Little Salt Spring would have looked like 12,000 years ago. And so what archaeologists have found by diving in the spring, where that ledge is that is now underwater, they've gone down there and actually found wooden artifacts that date to this Paleo-Indian time period. They've also found different animal bones of like extinct tortoises and other extinct animals that the Paleo people would have been hunting. So one of the theories is that, animals would kind of like fall in there. A big tortoise is not like too smart, right? It's gonna fall in there, and it's not gonna be able to get out, obviously. So the Paleo people would have been able to kind of rappel down in, grab the tortoise, pull it up on this ledge, and then have like a tortoise barbecue, pretty much. And there's been, some of these tortoise bones have been found in their burns. They've had, like wooden stakes like stuck in between the parts of the shells, and that kind of thing. And so a lot of the Paleo-Indian sites that we have, we really only find the stone tools, because think about it, it's like 14,000, 10,000 plus years ago. The wooden stuff that they make isn't going to survive. But at these wet sites and these springs and rivers, we have the opportunity to actually find things that they made out of other stuff like wood, which is really cool. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, just to clarify, when you say the salt springs, is this the one at the park that just recently opened to the public, or are we talking?
It's not open. That's War Mineral Spring, I think.
Okay.
But that one is open to the public, and that is also a really cool archaeological site with some Paleo-Indian components too.
Okay.
But that they're right close to each other.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah, they're pretty close to each other, yeah. And so, the Little Salt Spring, it's really cool because it gives us that kind of window into the past that we wouldn't really have otherwise. And I think the next kind of frontier in looking at these Paleo-Indian sites is actually going to be offshore, out in the Gulf of Mexico. Remember I said that like Florida was twice the size as it is today. So that means that we have all of that land that these Paleo people could have been living on that is now underwater. And throughout Florida's history, Native peoples have lived along the shorelines, right? A lot of the archaeological sites that come from like later time periods are really close to the shore. And so, the sites that we're looking at for Paleo people now, they're really, the ones that are on land now are actually like super inland sites that would have been back then. So there are some archaeologists who are actually using like ROVs and like different remote sensing techniques to look under the Gulf of Mexico to look for evidence of these Paleo-Indian people that's now underwater, which is super crazy. I don't want to go in a submarine, but I'm happy to learn about it and to talk about it.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
We were at Cedar Key and there was shell mound.
Yes.
Is that paleo? Or-
That one's not paleo, it's from a bit later, but that one is like a really, really cool archaeological site. And all those little islands that are around Cedar Key, they all have different archaeological sites on them too. Yeah. So, besides, a great place to get your water, a great place to, meet other people and marry off your kids, right? Springs in Florida are also really good, especially in this part of Florida and to our north, because they're a great resource for something else as well, and that's stone. A lot of times these spring areas, they're also near outcroppings of a special kind of stone that forms with limestone, and that kind of stone is chert. And chert is like the Florida version, if you've heard of like flint for making arrowheads and that sort of thing. Chert is the Florida version of that. They're like cousins, right? They're pretty much the same thing. And so these springs, they're also, great for getting this stone to make your stone tools. So, the springs would have been like a real hotbed of activity. You have all these animals coming here to drink. You can hunt them. You can meet up with your friends you haven't seen in a while. You can get your stone to make all your stone tools. You can hang out for a while, and then you could move on to somewhere else. So they would have been, like I said, an oasis in this kind of vast land with very few people in it. So they're really important. And so this neighborhood that you live in, it's been in a way a neighborhood for people for thousands and thousands of years, for like more than 10,000 years. People have been coming here and building communities in different ways. And not just in the Paleo-Indian time period, but also later. That's what's really, really special about this site here is a lot of these Paleo-Indian sites, it's just like we have stuff from that really early time period and maybe a little bit after, but then not so much after that. But here at the Elliott site, we have things from this Paleo-Indian period, but then almost all the way up through the rest of Florida prehistory. People have been coming here and leaving stuff behind, and building communities and making a place to live. So your neighborhood is built on that foundation of all that history and that heritage and all that great stuff, which is really cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different artifacts that we find, but were there any questions about what I've talked about so far before I get started on talking about this stuff? I'm also going to drink my water too. Yeah.
The site we're talking about, the little salt springs, how did they decide, was it just exploring and finding that ledge, or did they have some evidence that it was already there, and how did they come across that site?
That's a really good question. So it wasn't until like the 50s and 60s when scuba technology really came in that archaeologists were able to start looking underwater for these places. And so there was an archaeologist in the area who was working with some marine scientists as well. I think Eugenie Clark was one of the first people in there, Bill Royal. And they were, they went to a lot of these spring sites in the area, including War Mineral Spring, which you mentioned, and started kind of exploring and finding these things. Yeah, so it wasn't until we really had the technology to look that we were able to. So, like I said, most of the tools that we find that Paleo-Indians left behind are made of this stuff, which is chert. And I'll pass around some pieces of this too so everyone can see it in the back and everything. Has anyone ever seen someone making stone tools before? Ever seen the process? Any guesses how you do it? You're right, you chip the stone, right?
Something harder.
Right. And so the reason that this chert is so great for making stone tools is because it has a special way that it breaks. You can't just use any old rock to make a stone tool. It has to break in a certain way. So like limestone is like crumbly, it's not going to break to make a sharp edge, but chert is this kind of like mineralized form of limestone, and it has this special kind of fracture that geologists call a conchoidal fracture. So it breaks in these kind of flat planes, right? So think about it like if you've ever had like a rock come up and hit the windshield of your car, right? And you see like the little kind of like cone of the way that the glass breaks in your windshield, right? That's conchoidal fracture. It's the force is hitting that material and it's breaking it in a special kind of way that creates this sharp edge. Okay, so obviously chert's not going to like be as sharp as glass, but it does break also in that same way. And so when you're making stone tools, you're going to get your piece of chert, and then you get your what we call a hammer stone, like a river cobble and that kind of thing. And you're going to carefully chip it away and knock off these things we call flakes, which are just these little pieces of stone. All right. And the reason we're doing that is because usually when we find these rocks to make our stone tools, they don't look as pretty as that one over there. They've got this gross stuff on the outside, which we call cortex. It's like the weathered outside of it, right? So we need to get rid of it. And that's why, we're going to knock off those first flakes. I'm not going to actually do it because I'm going to be like stone pieces everywhere. But knock off those flakes until you get a really good one, like a good size one, bigger than this one, definitely. And then you're going to move on and use a tool like this. What is it? Yeah, like an antler, right, from a deer or something. So instead of our hammer stone, we're going to take our little antler and then we'll push off even smaller little flakes. and then we're gonna flake that into the shape that we want it to be. All right? So for every stone point that we find, or arrowhead, or spear point, we're gonna have hundreds and thousands of these little flakes, right, that are gonna come off of that process. But that does not mean that these are not important, because they can tell us a lot about the stone tool making process, and how people would do it. So I'm gonna pass out a little flake to everyone. How do you know if it's like an artifact or it's just like a piece of rock, right? That like chipped off of something. And so I'm gonna show you how we tell the difference. So now you'll be an expert and you'll be able to tell if it's a flake or if it's just a rock. All right, does everyone have a flake? Got it? All right. So one of the first things you'll probably notice about your flake is that one side of it probably feels like it's like one break surface, like it's more smooth. And then the other side is going to be more angled and have lots of like breaks from different, scars from other flakes coming off, okay? So your side that has lots of different angles, that's like the back side of the flake. So we call the dorsal side, like a dorsal fin on a dolphin. And then the other side that's like the one break, that's like the belly side of the flake. That's the part that came off of the core or the other stone that you knocked it off, okay? So when we break a stone, like when a person breaks a stone to make stone tools, you're hitting that stone in a really like focused way, right? I have my hammer stone, or I have my antler or something, and I'm hitting it in one spot, right? So thinking back to like your windshield that got hit by a rock, right? You see that place where the stone hit and then the force goes outwards from there, right? And so we can actually find that place on our flake. So find the belly side of your flake, the one side that's more flat, and run your finger over it. And you're gonna feel on one end of it that there's a little bump, probably. And we call that spot, that's the bulb of percussion. That's our big jargon word. That's the spot where somebody, however long ago, hit that rock and knocked that flake off of the core or the other rock. And that's the difference between a rock that is just knocked around and one that is made by people. Because you're not going to get that with just natural breakage. Because it's not that, focused, force on there like that. So if you find a little bit of rock and it's got a sharp edge and you feel that little bulb of percussion, that means that it's probably an artifact or a clue. So that's how you tell the difference. All right. So you can like hold your flake a little longer, it's fine. Or you can pass them all to the end of the thing, that's fine too. So the flakes are, they can tell us a lot about what people were up to, how they're making their stone tools. If we find lots of flakes that have that cortex, that gross stuff on the backside, then we know that that's a place where people were just doing the first stages of stone tool making, right? If we find lots of those little tiny flakes from someone sharpening a tool, then we know that that's kind of like that end stage of making the tool. Maybe they're resharpening it, or they're making it, the last stage before they're using the tool. So even the kinds of flakes that we find can be really helpful in telling about the past. The other thing that's, really helpful is the shape of the tools themselves. Can I get like 4 people to help me out? Anyone want to come up and be my fan of light up here?
Don't say anything. No.
So these are 4 different stone tools from 4 different time periods in Florida's prehistory. So archaeologists, obviously we can't go back in time and ask native peoples like, what did you call yourself? Right? What did you call your tribe? So we break down the things that we find into different cultures that we just find based on the technology that people were making, right? So did they make their stone tools in this way? Did they make their pottery in that way? And then we kind of break that down into these different cultures that change through time. So these 4 stone points represent 4 of these different culture time periods. And one is Paleo Indian, the oldest one, and we've got one that's archaic, one that's woodland period, and one that's Mississippian, and that's how they go in order, okay?
How do you date?
I'll get to that.
Becky, what was the fourth one?
Mississippian.
Oh.
Mississippi.
Yeah, we could like give them all kinds of crazy names, right? So one way that we date them is by looking at the style of the point, because originally we find these points in like a trash pit or something, and we can do like radiocarbon dating on the stuff around it, and we can figure out how old it is. But then we can kind of just look at the style, and we can figure out, okay, I know what time period this comes from. So there's a pattern to the way that these change through time, and I want to see if you guys can figure it out, and then get in order from what you think is the oldest one over on that side to the most recent one.
Can I read the date on the back?
Mine looks the crudest, I
Yeah,
think.
you're the
Yeah.
So you can amongst yourselves see if you can.
Oh, yours is even more so.
Yeah. I think him too.
Yeah, yours is more refined than his.
I think his
Mine
is
is
more
kinda
in between.
sharper. Should I go like
No, I
here?
think that, I think, well, I don't know, let me see. Yeah, it really
That's
is.
kinda,
I don't know
that's
whether you're
really
in
little.
here or there. I don't know.
the flakes are really small. All right, so where would you put me?
There between those two.
In between?
What do you think, those things, what do you think? You probably did it
Yeah.
wrong.
Paleo refers to an age, not a tribe, is that correct?
Yeah, it refers to a culture that archaeologists kind of define.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we don't have actual names for different tribes until we get into that kind of historic period, when we have some historical, documents. Since we have like the Tocobaga and the Calusa and all those ones that you kind of heard of before. All right, so you guys feel good?
It's a rock there.
Feel good about it?
Sure.
Hold up. So what do you guys think? Yes, no? Do we agree, disagree?
Oldest to newest.
Oldest. And I'm the oldest.
Pretty close.
I would
Pretty
switch,
close.
I would switch
This
to
one
middle
may be
one.
here.
Us.
You think she should be
Okay.
here? What do you think?
Remember, I said there's a pattern to how they change over time. So what pattern did you think that it was?
Sure.
Well, we, obviously, his is much more detailed with
That's
the,
true, yes.
with the arrows. So we figured that had to come from a lot of refinement.
Yours like the start of the refinement.
Yeah, hers was, we just had a little more crude. No offense. Nothing personal.
Okay.
Mine was really tiny, but yet there's no,
It's not, yeah.
it's
It
not,
doesn't-
I mean, this again had the curvature.
Yeah. That one's
So-
got something going on.
That's like the start of something going on.
Yeah.
Hers is more crude, mine is kinda, oh wow, I can make an arrowhead, you
Yeah,
know?
right, yeah.
Whoopee! And then we go into detail.
Okay.
Real.
Well, I would only change one thing, and so the pattern really is that it's about, they kind of go from being like biggest to like getting smaller.
Oh,
So yours is actually the most recent one.
Get out!
She's the baby.
I'm the baby in the bunch.
Baby. Yes.
Really?
And that's for
Yeah.
a good reason. So think about it.
They got finer and finer.
Yeah, so the Paleo Indians, right? They're hunting big animals. They're hunting these mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths and huge animals. So your one that you're holding is actually broken. So if you see
I
like,
think so, yeah.
it actually would be like really big,
Oh,
like that.
yeah.
So I kind of like
Oh.
tricked you, a little bit. That's okay. So it'd be really big.
Yeah.
And this was before the bow and arrow was even invented. So this would have been on the end of a big spear, right? So our next time period, your one that you have, see how it's got this kind of Christmas tree shape to it?
Yes.
That is super typical of the next time period, the archaic period. And so that's when we see these kind of Christmas tree style little points with this little kind of tab on the end. Any guesses why it has that little tab on the end? What would you do with that?
Sticks into.
Right, that's where you're gonna stick it either into a spear or into the handle of a knife or that kind of a thing. So sometimes we call those like projectile point / knives because we don't really know if it was for a spear or for a knife.
Right, okay.
And so the archaic period, when we have these things, this is also the time period when people really are using this other hunting tool that's called the atlatl. Has anyone ever seen an atlatl before? I was gonna bring one, but I totally forgot about it. It's like, if you've ever seen one of those things, it's like for throwing balls for your dog.
Oh,
That
yeah,
you put
yeah.
a chuck it or whatever they're called, and you put like a tennis ball and then you can throw it kind of farther. It's the same technology, pretty much. Except it's a stick with a hook on the end of it. And so you can put the end of your spear onto that hook, and when you throw it, you're throwing that spear way farther and faster than you could otherwise. So it's also before the bow and arrow. It's not until about like 3,000 years ago that the bow and arrow is invented. And then you can see that reflected in the stone points. So your one that you have here from the woodland period, it's much smaller, right? And that makes sense for being on the end of an arrow. If you had something heavy, it's just gonna go whoop and then like go straight into the ground, right? It's not gonna go too far. So that's why in these two later time periods, we have these smaller, kind of cruder points. I mean, that one is like very beautiful.
Yeah,
But
that's
yours is much more kind of like utilitarian, just like making something, throw it on the end of your arrow. Because it's going on your arrow and you might like never
Lose
see
it.
it again,
So
right?
it's gotta be quick and fast.
Exactly. Yep.
But I would have thought, it's funny, because it has a lot, to me, has a lot of detail with the little chips, but I guess that could be done quickly?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, that's.
And so this one is really cool. It even has like little serrated edges to it.
Yeah.
Serrated. Yeah. That is actually, it's not flint, it's actually a kind of fossilized coral called agatized coral. And if you're ever on Jeopardy and they ask you what the state stone of Florida is, it's agatized coral. So I just gave you the.
And that was the Daily Double.
Yeah, that was your fun fact to take back with you. It's actually a cast, but it's a cast of a Paleo Indian point, a Simpson point. And you can see it almost looks like a little fish. But this would have been really typical of that Paleo Indian time period.
What do you mean a cast?
It's yeah, it's a reproduction. But then once I'm done, everyone can feel free to come up and touch all the things that are on the table. So, you know, stone tools we find a lot for the Paleo Indians. The other sorts of tools that we find a lot all throughout Florida prehistory are shell tools, right? And that makes sense, right? In Florida, we're always close to the water. Use the shell for a tool, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And then once it's broken, Native peoples would pile those shells up and use it as like a building material. So it's like taking your food wrapper, making a hammer out of it, and then building your house out of food wrappers, right? So it's a lot of recycling. So anyone know what kind of shell this one is? Any shell fans out there?
I don't have my
Whelk?
It's a well.
Is it a whelk?
It is a whelk, yeah. It's a lightning whelk, right? So the lightning whelk is a really typical kind of shell that we find on Florida sites that Native peoples would use. And you can tell it's a lightning whelk because of its handedness. So like who in this room is left-handed? I'm not left-handed, but I'll raise my hand. A couple people, right? But most people are right-handed, right? So it's the same with shells in Florida. Most of the, what we would call gastropods, right, the conchs and whelks that we see, when you look at them, their opening is on the right side, on this side, right? Just like most people are right-handed. But the lightning whelk, it goes against the grain, it's left-handed. So as you look at it, it opens on the left-hand side. Okay, so that's one easy way to tell. And we find a lot of these on archaeological sites all throughout Florida. So, like I said, people would eat the animal and then make them into tools, like this. Any guesses what would you use this for?
Keeping your husband in line.
Yeah, digging. Yeah, maybe like digging. We call it a shell
Be
hammer.
careful.
So it's kind
In
of a
those days, it was
multi-purpose.
definitely in reverse.
A multi-purpose tool, back scratcher, husband keeper and liner. No. But you could use it for all different things. Like chopping wood. They would chop down trees with a shell on a stick like this. They would use this to carve pine logs into canoes that then they would canoe up and down the rivers and the waterways of Florida. All that good stuff. Florida actually has the biggest concentration in the world of these carved prehistoric canoes. More than anywhere in the world. these canoes have been found here in Florida, which is really cool. And they made those using tools like this.
Was that like the one I watched during
Yeah. Yeah, and so they always pop up like after hurricanes or people are walking on the shoreline and they find them and they're all over the place. There's one that was found a couple years ago in St. Petersburg at the Weeden Island site, and it's actually a 40-foot long canoe made of pine, 40 feet long. It's really crazy. It's a good, thankfully they have a 40-foot long hallway at the Weeden Island Center, so they were able to conserve it and put it on display. So that was a good forethought that they had there. But so shell tools we find a lot of, but obviously we're not going to find it looking like this, right? We're just going to find the shell without the handle and without this like sinew and all the stuff that's kind of holding it on there. So how are we going to be able to tell that that shell is an artifact and not just like a random shell at the beach? How does this shell look different? How has it been changed from the natural?
It's been drilled.
Yeah, this one has a hole here, right? And it also has a notch that's here for the handle. What else do you see that's been changed about it? Right, and this end part here, the siphon of the shell, has been shaped to make this better kind of cutting surface right here. Okay, and so that's how we tell the difference, right? That's how we say that something is an artifact and not just a natural shell. So like this one here, this is an actual artifact, but this is a different kind of a conch shell that's been, the outside has been kind of knocked off and it's been used as a kind of a pounding tool or a hammer. And so the reason that these shells are so great for making tools out of, like you wouldn't think that a shell would be good for chopping down a tree, right? If you were gonna like put me out in the woods with like a shell on a stick like and tell me to chop down a tree, like, I wouldn't think I could do that. But they're actually really, really strong. And that's because of the natural architecture of the shell, right? So this part that you see that's exposed now in the middle of the shell, that's called the columella, right? And it's just like the column in a building, right? It's gonna hold up the roof. It's the strength. It distributes the forces of the building. So the columella of the shell is doing the same thing. It's this really dense swirl of shell, and so it helps to distribute that force. So when you're hitting your shell hammer onto something, the shell doesn't shatter, the force is distributed through it, and you're able to use it as that tool. So Native peoples were really intelligent. They were able to look at the resources they had around them and use those natural resources to their advantage to do all the stuff that they needed, not just to survive, but to have, great lives and lots of kids and all that kind of good stuff. So they weren't just scraping by. People were living in big villages, having parties and ceremonies, doing fun stuff, hanging out together, and not just trying to like scrape by to survive. And one reason for that is also, because of these shells and these resources that they were able to get from the oceans and from our waterways. So any fisher people here in the room? Anyone like going fishing? This is a replica of a net that Native peoples would have made here in Florida. Native Americans here, they were really reliant in a lot of ways on these resources from the lakes and the rivers and the ocean. So we find a lot of artifacts related to fishing, whether that's actual fish hooks that they would make out of bone and shell, or nets. Sometimes we'll find the net weights that are shells, and special sites where we have really good preservation, sites that are like underwater or in muck. There have actually been pieces of net that have been found with these weights attached to it, which is really crazy. So, this was an important part of, everyday life for people. Think about like having to sit, having your kids making the cordage and then you weave the net and then someone goes out and does the fishing and brings it home. And that would have been, your day-to-day life, how you would live. We don't really have any evidence in this part of Florida until colonial times of agriculture. So all the people that were living in this part of Florida, They were hunting, gathering, but then also fishing and getting the things that they needed from the ocean. So instead of growing corn, they were like farming the seas. They were collecting oysters and fishing and getting their food that way, which is really cool. So the final kind of artifact I'll talk about is this stuff. Any guesses?
Shard?
Yeah, it's a pottery shard, right? And pottery is really cool because it's it's like the ultimate artifact, right? With stone and with shell, that's material that people are collecting and changing it a little bit to make it into something. But you do have to obviously collect clay from nature, but clay is something that you can really form and change into whatever you want it to be, right? So you can put whatever ideas, uses, whatever you want into that clay and make it into something. So the earliest pottery that we find here in Florida goes back to about like 4,000 years ago, all right? So like I said, people have been living in Florida for like more than 14,000 years, and only like 4,000 years ago did people start making pottery. So it was a relatively new invention here in Florida. So before that, people would make baskets and weave, that sort of thing. But pottery didn't come until much later. And it's also a really durable artifact, so we can, it'll stick around a long time so that we can find it, right? So, has anyone here ever made pottery before? A couple of people. Did you use a wheel to make the pot? So the native peoples here didn't have the pottery wheel, right? They didn't even have that. So they had to hand build their pottery. So they would, sometimes, like kids will make like a pinch pot, like in art class. You just take a knob of clay and then you pinch it around to make a pot. That's one method that they would use. They would also make coil pots. So you take the clay, roll it out into a big kind of snake, and then go around in a coil and then smooth the outside. And that's the main technique that they would have used to make their pots. So most of the pottery that archaeologists find, we're not going to find a whole pot. Really, the only place that we find whole pots is in burials, and that's because those pots were purposely placed there with the deceased person. Most of the pottery that we find is broken in little pieces like this, and we call that a shard or a sherd, because we have to, archaeologists have to make everything difficult, so we have to make it, something else, a sherd, right? And that just means a broken piece of pottery. And a lot of the pottery that we find is plain pottery, but then we also find ones that are really beautifully decorated. They would use all different sorts of techniques. They would use wooden stamps to press into the wet clay to make designs on it. Some of them were kind of like check pattern designs, almost like an Eggo waffle kind of design if you think about it. Some were carved stamps that were in, wouldn't be archaeology without a little dirt on your fingers. But then also, and so that's kind of like the everyday stuff. But the really fine pottery that they would make for different ceremonies and kind of religious ceremonies and that sort of thing, especially in the woodland period, like I was talking about the different time periods with the stone points, that woodland period, the almost kind of second to the last one, they also made really beautiful fine pottery in the shapes of different animals, especially birds, and especially water birds. So like water birds, and then birds related, like carrion birds, like vultures and that sort of thing, right? And that sort of pottery is the kind of pottery that we find in these burial mounds and with the burials of the people from that time period. So that makes sense, right? I mean, like a vulture, that makes sense that it's associated with like death, and you find it in a burial. The water birds are interesting. They really fit into the kind of worldview that, the religion that Native peoples kind of still have today, and we think is, fits in with their religion that they had back then. That the underworld, where the dead would go, was this kind of watery place, right? Like watery underworld. We have the world in three parts. The underworld is water, then we have the land, and then we have the sky, right? And so water birds, they traverse all three of those worlds, right? They can go into the water, They can dive down and float on it, they can come onto the land, and then they can fly in the sky as well. And so that's one reason that we think that those were important or sacred birds, is because they fit in with their kind of worldview and their religion in that way, which is really cool. So, the work of the archaeologist is to find these things, to find these sites, to carefully document them, almost like a crime scene, to come in and map out where everything is, see what it is, see its relation to everything else, and then to piece that story back together. And like I said, the only way that we know about the lives of these people who were living in Florida, the first explorers who came to Florida, people who discovered Florida more than 14,000 years ago, is because of the stuff that they left behind. And that's why it's really important to preserve these places and to document them so that we don't lose that information. And and living in this neighborhood, it's important especially for you all to understand that, so that if you do find something, you can know what it is, and then you can tell someone about it, so that that information can be recorded and not lost. And I think that's the wonderful thing that happened with the site here, is that that story can live on because you shared that information. And so, it's a really wonderful thing, so thank you. All right, yeah.
I heard a rumor that they were going to start diving in Paleo, in the sinkhole. They were going to start, or have they?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if anyone has maybe.
Yeah, that goes back to 2000, and we had a couple that did work for National Geographic that came up and did diving, because at that point in time we really didn't understand the depth. And we heard everything from 120 feet, 50 feet. We found out finally between 25 and 30 feet.
Yeah.
But has there been like a lot of sediment and stuff that's kind of floated
Yes,
in? Right?
you can see it right now, like
Yeah.
leaves off trees and everything, the runoff, erosion.
Yeah.
A lot of golf balls in there.
Golf ball.
Yeah, and you can walk
There's like
on
the golf ball
balls.
culture.
Layered
golf balls.
Not
There's
artifact.
plenty of golf balls to the Paleo site.
Yeah. But the other thing too is the simple fact that we had wells drilled in the near vicinity that were, one was 142 feet deep. That would go down to the aquifer,
Yeah.
hit the aquifer, and then go through the aquifer to get the water to bring up and that sort of thing.
Right.
So you can compare maybe the depth of that with the original depth
Yeah.
of the sinkhole, but like you said, at that point in time, our land would extend as far as 50 to 75 miles further west out into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And there's a pickup.
Well, there's a 78 pickup truck. And they came up and told us, all the oil had washed out of it and everything. It was a good place for fish to do their spawning, whatever, so we left it in there.
Just wait a few more years and it'll be an archaeological.
Yeah.
It'll probably be an artifact, and then you can document that
years from
too. Yeah.
Supposed to be on the surface then.
Any questions?
If pottery wasn't found until like 4,000 years ago in the area, what were the ancient people using to convey water and travel?
Yeah, so they definitely used shells to make them into like containers. They also could weave such fine baskets that they would hold water as well. They would also use animal skins to hold water and to cook in as well. So, and I'm sure that before, tortoise shells. I'm sure before real pottery was kind of like invented, they would also take clay and put it on a basket as well to keep it watertight. And that's one of the theories of how they really came up with pottery itself, is that they're putting this clay on the outside of baskets, and then if you heat it up, and then it's like, oh, okay, well, just get rid of the basket and we'll just, use the clay and do it that way, kind of a thing. So that's one theory of how people started making pottery. Any other questions that I can answer? Well, thank you all. You've been a really wonderful audience. And like I said, if you see something, say something, right? Like if you see artifacts that are on your property, you can take some pictures of them, send them up to the archaeologists in Tallahassee, you know, share it, get that information out there.
After originally turning over, we turned over about 4,100 pieces to the state, okay, in the original collection. But since that period, I picked up an additional 392 pieces.
Wow.
And two of these pieces were like probably dating early archaic or paleo, had serrated edges on them.
Oh,
And I had never found one like that
Very
before, so
cool.
we'll
Yeah,
probably
those
end
are
up
neat.
turning that over to the state to add to the collection up there.
Where were they found?
Pardon?
Where did you find the additional pieces?
Well, when we did the reclaimed water project in here and that sort of thing, there was a lot of trenching going on, digging
Okay.
going on. And when there was anything like that, I would get out and take a peek at it, so.
Very neat. Everything we found was on the surface.
oh, yeah,
We
yeah. I'm
did
sure.
They were,
We did no digging, but the simple fact is too, when they did the retention areas, there's 63 retention areas in here and 3 good ones right there for the sinkhole, the site. And it went down as much as 12, 15 feet lower, taking these out, and you got to old cultural levels that you would be
Yeah.
for.
And I mean, they're just, people have been living here for such a long time that it's just, you know, artifacts scattered everywhere. You know, it makes, and when I was driving in here, I was like, okay, this makes sense. You know, we've got this, like, we are right now on this, like, kind of high ground, like, little hill. We've got all these little spring seats and things that are around. Like, this is totally the perfect area to find a site. Anywhere where you have that high ground next to a source of fresh water is going to have archaeological sites. But the special thing about this place is that we have that really, really early component that we don't always find everywhere else. So that's what's really special about
Have
it.
you personally been there?
I haven't been there
I'm
yet.
gonna take her over after. Yeah, it was just too cold this morning.
Yeah, we all would have been like shivering.
Just so you know, Herb put together this book of the artifacts that were found. It's always in the library. So you can find this in there. You can see all the pictures of what he collected and sent up to Tallahassee. So we really owe a debt of gratitude to them for doing this, for the Thank you, Becky, so much. It was so
Yeah.
interesting.
And like I said, if anyone wants to come up and look at all the other stuff I have up here, please feel free. You can pick up and touch whatever. So I'm happy to answer any other questions you have as well. So thank you very much.